Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we want to return to the subject of Terramaster, and today we're looking at the F6-424 Max. I'm just going to keep calling it the F6 Max for the rest of this video. It's just too much of a mouthful, but Terramaster have really kind of refurbed, refitted and relaunched a number of their solutions in the last 12 months with the new chassis, new hardware ports and connections, new CPU choices, and ultimately reinvigorating the brand a great deal. They spent a lot of the time as the cheap budget area of the market, but I will say with innovations in their software and definite upgrades in the hardware, they become a much more substantial player than they were, and they are hoping to challenge the likes of Synology and QNAP, at least in terms of value for money, but also just general hardware availability. Available in the majority of different platforms out there, not just Amazon anymore, and challenging the price point of many. A number of you have been looking over the fence from your Synology, your QNAP, your Asus stores, even true NAS and Unraid users, and looking at the simplicity and the price point of Terramaster and going, is it worthy of my time? And that's what this video is about. Today I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the F6 Max may well be the right NAS for you. But I'm also going to give you 5 reasons where you might want to stay on the fence a little bit longer. But before we start, I will say I've done a similar video to this on the 4-bay version of this device, the F4-424 Max. And a number of the same points are going to be raised. So if you've watched that video, you're going to see a lot of this coming. Not all of it, but definitely a lot of it. But apart from that, let's crack on with number 1. The connectivity on this is pretty darn good, and although I could bang on about the USB ports, which, let's face it, would bore the hell out of you, I will say that the fact this 6-bay arrives with 2 10GBE ports is beautiful to me. If you look at the bulk of 6-bay solutions in the market from the established players of turnkey NAS solutions, very, very few of them have 2 times 10GBE. The majority have 1 or settle on 2.5G or 1GBE. Now, there is an argument that 2 times 10GBE on a 6 SATA based system is overkill because there isn't the facility to saturate a 20 gigabit connection. Those ports, remember, support link aggregation, port trunking, SMB multi-channel. So a 20 gigabit pipeline is possible here. So why have they added these 2 10GBE ports when most others haven't? Well, we'll cover that more in point 3. But I will say right now, this system does have the facility to saturate those 2 10G connections, and arriving at 1000 Nika, this device definitely puts itself ahead of others in terms of network ports and connectivity. Now, the CPU inside this device also left me moderately pleased, although not fully. We'll get on that later on. Arriving with an i5 Intel core, and that is the 1235U. That is a 10-core, 12-thread processor, 8 efficiency cores, 2 power cores. Also with Xe graphics going up to 1.25 gigahertz. Is a decent amount of graphical capability, but general horsepower at your disposal inside this device. Now, that CPU obviously has a greater power consumption. At peak, it's reported with a TDP of 55 watt. It goes down to 15 watt very easily when in idle. So even if you are slightly intimidated by a more power-hungry CPU, keep in mind that your NAS, although it may be on 24 hours a day, the amount of time you actually spend using it will be significantly less. So the power consumption, when it does drop down in idle to that reported 15 watts, is still pretty darn good. And keep in mind, that is a very, very capable CPU. So when you do need it, the horsepower is there, whether it is for multimedia, virtual machines, or general file transmission via those 10Gs I just mentioned. PCIe Gen 4 x 4 M.2 NVMe. That was a lot of jargon to throw at you, and if you're not technologically versed, that means nothing. Let me explain. Notwithstanding the 6 bays of SATA storage here on the front, it doesn't end there. This system also arrives with 2 M.2 NVMe SSD bays, 1 on either side. Both of them are Gen 4 x 4. That is an 8 gigabytes per second bandwidth architecture there. Now, depending on the SSDs you put inside, as long as you use a Gen 4 x 4 SSD, you've got a lot of bandwidth there to play with. Now, when I did do testing on this architecture, the speeds I got were around 5 to 6 gigabytes per second. Higher read over write, of course. But that does mean that alongside the main storage bays, you've also got a super fast dual bay area of storage for a scratch disk, for editing over 10GBE, for caching. But more importantly, you can do both. You've got two bays. You could use one SSD for caching on the system, for read caching, use them both for read-write caching to improve your performance up and down. But more importantly, use one as a super fast area of storage. Run the OS from it, run virtual machines from it. Or, as mentioned, connect to this via 10GBE with two connections on a dual port 10GBE card and edit directly on the system on that, and use the legacy, larger capacity, slower but more affordable hard drive space to archive for your cold data over time. I don't think I can stress how rare 4x4 slots on NAS devices actually are. Gen 4 SSD bays on hybrid NAS solutions that have both hard drives and M.2 NVMe's isn't that rare anymore. Lots have Gen 4, but many of them downgrade the speeds of the M.2s, either for temperature reasons or just the inability to supply the bandwidth across the system via both the PCIe lanes and the connected lanes to each of the individual switches internally. This, on the other hand, gives 4x4 on both of them. We went in via SSH and we identified, with no downgrades, that 4x4 connection on each M2. So that means not only easy full saturation of the 10Gs as mentioned, but faster acting storage for your applications and for whatever need you have for this device. And we can't keep banging on about storage without touching on T-RAID, a flexible RAID system on this, not unlike what you remember from Drobo and the likes of Synology, the ability to mix and match drives. That means that you could get hold of a system like this, and rather than fully populating it with the same drives or with mixed drives, what you can do is get it on day one and leverage some of the spending towards maybe getting 2 to 3 4TB drives. That will give you 8 to 12 TB depending on the RAID configuration you choose to use. Now, a few years down the line, you might want to add more storage. A flexible RAID system like T-RAID allows you to put 8 TBs, 10 TBs, 20 TBs, and be able to imbibe and utilize the larger capacity in a way that normal RAID functionality, like a RAID 5, a RAID 6, or a RAID 1, will cap you at the size of the lowest size drive. So on T-RAID, mix and match. Traditional RAID would make you have to fix to each capacity. So again, it's a very small feature, but in terms of scalability, alongside, by the way, a number of different expansion devices, this system has got some great scalability. And finally, onto the software. TOS 6 that this arrives with is arguably better than it's ever been. The design I'm not completely in love with. I've been pretty detailed about that online, but I will say that the feature set for backups, for native client backups, for multimedia streaming, for virtualization is better than it's ever been. File management, accessing the GUI, and the mobile app have all seen upgrades. And again, they aren't really going to challenge Synology or QNAP yet, but they are closing the gap. But what really helps them close the gap on top of all of the innovations in their software and the applications and the third-party applications they support is that you can install a third-party OS on this. You can go ahead and install Proxmox, TrueNAS, Unraid, Open Media Vault, all of them on this. The bootloader for this is delivered via a USB key inside, which you can remove or disable via the BIOS and introduce your own operating system. And Terramaster say it will not affect your hardware warranty. They won't be able to software support you if you go down the third-party OS route, but they will support your hardware warranty just like they would if you only use their operating system. So not only have they got their own operating system that's evolving and getting better, although there is still a way to go, it is important to note that you can still take advantage of other popular and well-regarded software as well as their own too. Unfortunately though, it can't all be good news, and alongside those 5 good things, we've got to talk about 5 things that may well put you off. given this system is $1,000 or $999, I will say that their approach towards memory will leave some users baffled. Number one, it isn't ECC memory. Now that is a CPU limitation. The fact they've gone for that CPU, and I'll touch on that more later, has definitely limited it in terms of support of ECC. So though I can't criticize the brand for that, I will say that definitely there will be some users that will be put off by the lack of ECC on this, and therefore it's worthy of highlighting. But the other thing is it only arrived with 8 gig of memory. Now, for $1,000, I would expect minimum 16, maybe even 32 gig of memory. Indeed, when you look at some of the other scaled up solutions, a number of different Terramaster devices actually have more than that. And it's kind of weird to me that this 6-bay only has 8 gig of memory for the price point. It's still a solid box, and 8 gig of memory is still a decent amount, which can be scaled up, by the way, via the 2 available SODIMM slots inside. But 8 gig at that price point is definitely a little underwhelming. Do you remember all that praise I gave the 10GBE connections on this? Well, hold my beer, because it doesn't always turn out great. And I'll tell you right now, the HDMI output on this device is borderline useless. Now, I have to add the caveat that if you choose to use a third-party operating system like TrueNAS or Unraid, you're going to need the HDMI output there to get into BIOS and install some of those OS-based SSD operating systems, again like TrueNAS, and needs to run from its own disk. But if you use this with Terramaster software, that HDMI output is practically useless. There's no parallel GUI. You can't assign some applications to it. It'd be great if you could do a virtualization out on there to create a local interface for your VM running parallel to that of the remote access for a VM, or even container utilization. The HDMI utilization on this is supremely limited, and again, although I can't really blame the brand too much because that is universal across all of them, I will say that they have had HDMI on their systems now for many, many years, and the brand still continues to do precious little with it. If you thought I was going to get annoyed about the HDMI, the lack of USB 4 on this, frankly, pisses me right off. I have seen that CPU inside there used with a myriad of systems in the last 18 months, and the bulk of them have arrived with USB 4 output. Now, USB 4 output in some cases has been limited to 20 gigabits per second rather than the traditional 40 gigabits per second, but alongside this system lacking that much faster direct storage input, which would have been great for expansion devices and connecting SSD expansion devices. But on top of that, the idea that there are devices in the market, like the ZimmerCube for example, and even Asustor with their AMD Ryzen powered USB 4 systems that allow for a small amount or total network connectivity over USB. Now, USB 4, if it was on here and they got the right drivers in place, would allow me on my USB 4 system to directly connect to this and give myself between 20 and 40 gigabits per second direct editing, freeing up the 10 GBEs for other users. And remember, there are 2 Gen 4 M2 NVMe slots inside there, so there's more than enough bandwidth to go around if I rated those together. USB 4 isn't going to be for everyone, and as mentioned, the extent to which USB 4/TB4 network over IP is limited in some cases, but nevertheless, the fact that this is the latest Terramaster to arrive with that CPU in this max architecture and no USB 4 is just annoying. Now, some of you are going to consider this point a little bit churlish, but I'll say right now, the fact that the price difference between the 4-bay and the 6-bay device is $100 seems pretty weird to me. Now, why is it weird to me? Well, it's because short of these 2 extra bays, these systems are identical. The same Gen 4x4 architecture on the M.2s, the same 2x10 GBE on the rear, the same 8 gig of DDR4 memory there, the same CPU, everything's exactly the same. And I get it. As they scale up the systems, it's going to cost a bit more. But £100 or $100, it's the same. I've checked on both of the price points there on their site. Seems a little bit much for me. Why? And again, returning to my earlier point, doesn't the 6-bay just have a bit more memory? Why doesn't it have just that little bit more? I think 100 nicker for between the 4 and the 6-bay is a bit aggressive. And the only reason I bring it up is because if a number of you are considering this 6-bay, but you haven't quite got the dough to stretch to $1,000, the 4-bay just gives you exactly the same thing, just short of 2 bays, and you'll save yourself 100 nicker. And finally, we return to the subject of that CPU, because although that CPU has a decent little balancing act on power consumption, you know, cores, threads and more, and what it supports and what it can do with the integrated graphics, I will say it ain't the newest CPU on the block. And right now in January 2024, this CPU is more than 3 years old. It was released in the first quarter of 2022, so it's about 3 years. And although that's not a tremendously huge amount of time, there are a lot of other Intel Core CPUs in the market they could have opted for. And although this 3-year-old CPU is still very good, it's been used in systems for many years, and given this is their latest 6-bay, it does seem a little bit old to rock out a CPU with a system now that's 3 years behind the fold. 3 years might not seem much to many of you. Hell, Synology are still rocking out a 5-year-old CPU in the J4125. But 3 years may matter to some of you who want to purchase a system or are thinking of long-term, future-proofing. And Intel are already rolling out alternative Intel Core processors that we've seen in the DIY sector, which outperform this one. Again, I can understand that Terramaster want to keep this affordable and within a certain price point, and with that, it makes sense, and it is a good CPU. But I just thought it worth noting that it is by no means the newest i5 on the block. But there you go, that is the Terramaster F6-424 Max. How does it sound to you? Do you like it? Have you already got one? Maybe you've gone for the 4-bay. Let me know what you think in the comments. There should be a link to the written review below as well, but I would really welcome your input on this. I know some of my negative points on this may seem a little nebulous, and I'd really look forward to hearing your input just to see if I'm not seeing the wood for the trees. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.